In the spring of 1999, Britain was a nation living in two worlds at once. On one hand, there was a profound sense of optimism, a countdown to a new millennium, a new government, a new confidence, a feeling that the future was bright. But on the other hand, there was the shadow of conflict. British forces were engaged in a bombing campaign over Yugoslavia, in a war that felt distant, yet was broadcast nightly into our living rooms. It was a time of peace and war, of hope and anxiety, all existing in the same breath. And in the midst of it all, Britain had a favorite, a person who seemed, to millions, to embody the very best of the nation. She was warm, she was intelligent, she was trustworthy. She was the girl next door who had become a national treasure. Her name was Jill Dando. Before we dive into the details, I want to ask you to do something. Let me know where you're watching from in the comment section, and do not forget to subscribe to this channel. We cover cases like this with the respect they deserve, not for entertainment, but for education and for the memory of those who can no longer speak for themselves. Turn on notifications so you don't miss our next investigation. Your support helps us continue this work. Thank you. Jill Wendy Dando wasn't born into fame. She was from Weston-super-Mare, a seaside town in Somerset, a grammar school girl who worked her way up through local radio. Her talent and undeniable charisma were impossible to ignore. She joined the BBC in 1985, and for the next 14 years, she became a constant, reassuring presence on our screens. From the cheerful chaos of breakfast time to the holiday dreams on holiday, and finally, to the serious, groundbreaking work on Crime Watch. On Crime Watch, Jill was more than just a presenter. She was the public's bridge to the world of law enforcement. She looked into the camera, and she spoke to us directly, not as a journalist reading a script, but as a concerned citizen asking for our help. She gave a voice to the voiceless and a face to the fallen. She made us feel that together we could achieve justice. It was this unique blend of approachability and authority that made her so beloved. She wasn't just a celebrity. She felt like family, a friend you invited into your home every evening, which is why, when that family was so violently and inexplicably broken, the entire country felt the wound. Monday, April 26, 1999. It was a bright, clear morning in London, the kind of morning that promises a fine spring day. At 37 Gowan Avenue in Fulham, a neat red brick terrace house, Jill Dando was preparing for the day ahead. She was a busy woman. Her life was a meticulously planned diary of meetings, recordings, and social engagements. At around 9:50 a.m., she was seen by a neighbor walking towards her front door. She had just returned from a trip to the local shops. She was carrying her keys and a newspaper. She smiled, a brief, friendly gesture. It was the last time she would be seen alive by anyone who knew her. What happened in the next few seconds remains a central, horrifying mystery of this entire case. The front door to her home was closed. The path was neat. The street was quiet. Somewhere in that tranquil, ordinary space, a killer was waiting, or had arrived, or had been let in. The truth is, we don't know. What we do know is this: a single, powerful shot, a gunshot fired at point-blank range, that ended the life of Jill Dando. It was a swift, brutal, and incredibly professional act. The bullet entered her head just above her left ear. She fell where she stood, collapsing onto her doorstep, a single, mortal wound in a nation's heart. She was discovered at 11:47 a.m. A neighbor, noticing her door was ajar and seeing her body on the step, called the police. The scene they arrived at was one of chilling precision. There was no great struggle, no signs of a frenzied attack. Just a woman, cut down in the prime of her life, on the doorstep of the one place she should have been safe. Her home. The news broke with the speed of a thunderclap. It didn't seem possible. Jill Dando? Murdered? The names and faces of victims on Crime Watch were familiar to us. But the presenter herself? It was a plot line from a dark fantasy, a horrifying version of reality. And in that first raw moment of shock, a question hung in the air, a question that would echo for decades. Who and why would want to kill Jill Dando? The immediate aftermath was a vortex of grief and disbelief. Flowers began to pile up outside her home, a colorful, fragrant memorial to a life cut short. The BBC was plunged into mourning. Her colleagues, stunned, spoke of her with a mixture of love and profound loss. Her fiancé, Alan Farthing, a consultant gynecologist, was away at work that morning. He was met by police as he returned to the street where he should have been planning his wedding, not identifying his murdered partner. The police response was immediate and immense. This wasn't just any murder. The victim was one of the most famous women in Britain. The pressure to solve it was enormous. They named the investigation Operation Oxblood, and from the very beginning, they knew they were hunting for a ghost, a killer who had appeared from nowhere, committed the perfect crime, and vanished back into the ether. The initial focus was on the scene itself. Forensic teams swarmed over Gowan Avenue, looking for anything, a footprint, a fiber, a discarded casing. But the killer was meticulous. No bullet casing was ever found. The weapon, a 9mm caliber pistol, was gone. The only significant piece of physical evidence found on Jill's body was a single strand of blonde hair, which was later determined not to be her own, but its origin was unknown. The public appeal was unprecedented. On the next edition of Crime Watch, the show Jill had once hosted, her colleague, Nick Ross, made an emotional plea for information. The police received over 10,000 calls. Thousands of names were put forward: jealous ex-lovers, obsessed fans, rival journalists, criminals who had been featured on her show. The list was endless. It was a needle in a haystack the size of a country. In those first few weeks, the investigation felt like a chaotic blur of activity. They were looking for a man seen acting suspiciously in the area that morning. A man in a dark suit, perhaps carrying a mobile phone. Another witness saw a man with a trance-like stare. But these leads went nowhere. The leads were contradictory, the sightings unreliable. The police were faced with three main, broad possibilities. One, it was a random act, a mugging gone wrong, though nothing was stolen. Two, it was a personal attack, a stalker, someone obsessed with Jill, whose love had curdled into a deadly possessiveness. Or three, it was a professional hit, a targeted assassination carried out by someone with military or paramilitary training. And as the weeks turned into months and the initial chaos subsided, the detectives began to focus their gaze on one man, a local man, a strange man, a man who lived just a short walk from Gowan Avenue. His name was Barry George. On the surface, Barry Michael George was a nobody, a 40-year-old unemployed man with a long history of bizarre behavior, petty crime, and a desperate craving for attention. But as the police dug into his life, they began to build a portrait of someone who was far more than just a local eccentric. They believed they had found their man. The story of how they came to that conclusion is a journey into the heart of a flawed investigation, a miscarriage of justice, and a mystery that, even today, remains profoundly unsolved. In any murder investigation, there's a critical turning point, a moment when the chaos of 1,000 leads coalesces into a single, sharp point of focus. For Operation Oxblood, that point was Barry George. The police didn't stumble upon him by chance. They were led to his doorstep by a combination of local intelligence, his own peculiar history, and a series of circumstances that, when viewed through a certain lens, painted a deeply disturbing picture. Barry George lived in a flat on Crookham Road, less than half a mile from Jill Dando's house. He was, to put it mildly, a well-known figure in the area, known for being strange, known for telling elaborate, fantastical lies about his past. He would often claim to be a former SAS soldier, a friend of royalty, or a stuntman for Hollywood films. None of it was true, but this compulsive need for a different, more exciting identity was a key part of who he was. When police first searched his flat on May 15, 1999, nearly a month after the murder, they found what can only be described as a shrine of fame and celebrity. The walls were covered with pictures of famous people, many of them female celebrities. Among them, they found photographs of Jill Dando. They also found a large collection of military-style clothing, including a balaclava and combat boots. And they found something else, something that would become the cornerstone of the entire case against him. A single, tiny particle of firearms discharge residue, trapped in the pocket of a coat he owned. To the prosecution, this was a smoking gun. The microscopic link that placed Barry George at the scene of the crime, with a gun in his hand. To the defense, it was a piece of contaminated, meaningless evidence, the result of sloppy forensic work. The battle over that single particle would define the entire case. But the residue was just one piece of a much larger, more circumstantial puzzle the police were building. They began to dig into Barry George's past, and what they uncovered was a long and troubling history of stalking and sexual violence. In the 1980s, he had been convicted of attempted rape after he followed a woman home and attacked her in her hallway. The similarities to the Dando case, in terms of approaching a victim at their home, were not lost on police. He had also been arrested multiple times for indecent assault and for trespassing at the homes of celebrities, most notably the Freddie Mercury Museum and the royal family's Kensington Palace. This wasn't just a man with a few odd habits. This was a man with a documented pattern of obsessive behavior directed at famous figures. And Jill Dando, perhaps the most famous and beloved woman in Britain at the time, was the ultimate prize for an obsession like his. The police theory began to take shape. Barry George, the fame-obsessed stalker, had fixated on Jill Dando. He had watched her, followed her, and learned her routines. On the morning of April 26, he lay in wait for her outside her home. He was armed with a pistol. When she arrived, he confronted her. In a moment of terrifying, ultimate intimacy, he pressed a gun to her head and pulled the trigger, fulfilling a dark fantasy of power and connection to the world of celebrity he so desperately wanted to be a part of. It was a compelling narrative. It was simple, it was psychologically plausible, and it seemed to fit the man they had uncovered. But a compelling narrative is not the same as proof, and the police knew they needed more. They needed to place him at the scene. They needed witnesses. And so began the process of fitting Barry George into the memories of the witnesses. In the days and weeks following the murder, several people had come forward with sightings of a suspicious man on Gowan Avenue. One witness described seeing a man of average height and build, with fair hair, standing near the crime scene around the time of the murder. Another described a man with a distinctive, wide-eyed stare. During the investigation, police showed these witnesses a photograph of Barry George. Suddenly, the memories began to crystallize. The man with the fair hair, yes, that could be him. The man with the wide-eyed stare, that was definitely him. The power of suggestion is a potent thing, especially when the police are convinced they have their man. Witnesses, wanting to help, wanting to be the one who provides a crucial breakthrough, can begin to reshape their own memories to fit the suspect in front of them. This is not to say the witnesses were lying. It's more complex than that. It's about the fragility of human memory and the influence of authority. The police had a theory, and they were now looking for the facts to support it, rather than letting the facts lead them to a theory. It's a subtle but critical shift in investigative thinking, and one that can have devastating consequences. The case against Barry George was growing, but it was almost entirely circumstantial. There was no murder weapon. There was no direct eyewitness to the shooting. The forensic link was hotly contested. The witness identifications were unreliable. But the pressure on Operation Oxblood was immense. The media was in a frenzy. The public was demanding answers. Jill Dando's family deserved justice. And after more than a year of investigation, all roads, in the eyes of the police, led to one man. On May 2nd, 2000, Barry George was charged with the murder of Jill Dando. He pleaded not guilty. The stage was set for one of the most high-profile trials in British legal history. It would be a battle not just of evidence, but of narratives. The prosecution story of an obsessed stalker versus the defense's story of an innocent, if very strange, man who was a victim of a desperate police search for a scapegoat. The trial will begin in April 2001. The eyes of the world would be watching, and the fate of Barry George and the official version of what happened to Jill Dando hung in the balance. A criminal trial is a strange and ritualized theater. It is a place where stories are told, where evidence is performed, and where the truth is not always a central character. For the trial of Barry George, the stakes could not have been higher. This wasn't just about the fate of one eccentric man from Fulham. It was about providing a final, definitive answer to the question that had haunted the nation for 2 years. Who killed Jill Dando? The prosecution, led by William Boyce QC, laid out their case with clarity and confidence. Their argument was straightforward. Barry George was a dangerous, fame-obsessed stalker. He had a history of targeting women and celebrities. He had fixated on Jill Dando, the ultimate celebrity. He had stalked her, and on the morning of April 26, 1999, he had murdered her in a cold-blooded, execution-style killing. The centerpiece of their case was, of course, that single particle of firearms discharge residue found in Barry George's coat pocket. The prosecution brought in a forensic expert who testified that the particle was consistent with the residue that would be discharged from a firearm. They argued it was highly unlikely to have got there through contamination. It was, they claimed, the microscopic fingerprint that linked George to the murder weapon. They paraded a string of witnesses who spoke to Barry George's character, women he had harassed or followed in the past. They painted a picture of a man who was a ticking time bomb, a predator who lived on the fringes of society, nursing a dark obsession with the famous. And then there were the witnesses from Gowan Avenue. One by one, they took the stand. A local resident who saw a man loitering with intent near the house. Another who saw a man running away, though the description was vague. The prosecution did its best to link these sightings to Barry George, asking the witnesses if the man they saw could have been the defendant sitting in the dock. The suggestions were subtle, but they were there. The courtroom watched Barry George throughout the trial. He was an unsettling figure. He often stared blankly into space. He made notes in a strange, spidery script. He sometimes wore a single earring, a small stud, which the prosecution pointed to as another sign of his eccentricity. He didn't look like a normal person, and in the court of public opinion, which was running parallel to the actual court, his strangeness was often mistaken for guilt. The defense, led by Michael Mansfield QC, one of Britain's most renowned barristers, had a monumental task. Their job was to dismantle the prosecution's narrative piece by piece and to create enough reasonable doubt in the minds of the jury. Their first target was forensic evidence. They brought in their own team of world-class experts who tore the prosecution's case apart. They argued that the forensic science of firearms residue was far from exact. They demonstrated that the particle found in George's pocket could have come from any number of sources. It could have been transferred from a police officer, from a contaminated surface in the forensic lab itself, or from the thousands of other items of clothing that were processed in the same facility. The defense's key argument was this: you cannot build a murder conviction on a single, invisible, and potentially contaminated particle. They then challenged the so-called stalking history. While they didn't deny Barry George's past convictions, they argued that the attempted rape from the 1980s was a completely different type of crime. That was a messy, chaotic sexual assault. The murder of Jill Dando was a cool, clinical, professional assassination. The two, they argued, did not match. To conflate them was to ignore the facts of the case. The defense also attacked the witness sightings. They highlighted the inconsistencies and the changes in testimony after the witnesses had been shown Barry George's photograph. They argued that the police had, consciously or not, shaped the memories of these people to fit their preferred suspect. The man seen on Gowan Avenue, they argued, remained a phantom. There was no reliable evidence it was Barry George. Perhaps the most damning part of the defense's case was their exploration of other potential suspects and theories. The police had, from the very beginning, investigated other lines of inquiry. One of the most compelling was the possibility of a professional hit linked to the war in Kosovo. The BBC, and specifically its World Service, had been a key part of the British propaganda effort during the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia. Serbian state media had been broadcasting anti-BBC rhetoric for weeks. Just days before her murder, a Serbian newspaper had published a list of so-called enemies of the Serbian state, which included several BBC journalists. Was it possible that Jill Dando, as one of the BBC's most prominent faces, was targeted in a retaliatory attack? A professional assassination designed to send a message? The defense argued that the police had been so quick to focus on Barry George that they had failed to properly investigate this and other credible leads. They suggested that the killer could have been a hired assassin, a professional who knew how to leave no trace. This theory would explain the single professional shot, the lack of a struggle, and the absence of any forensic evidence. It was a theory that couldn't be proven, but it created a powerful cloud of reasonable doubt. For weeks, the jury listened to these two competing narratives: the prosecution's story of a lone, obsessive weirdo, and the defense's story of a police force under pressure, chasing the wrong man, while the real killer, a professional assassin or another unknown phantom, remained at large. The fate of Barry George rested in the hands of 12 ordinary people. They had to weigh the flimsy circumstantial evidence of the prosecution against the powerful, unanswered questions raised by the defense. They had to decide, beyond a reasonable doubt, if this strange, unlikable man was a cold-blooded murderer. After deliberating for nearly 30 hours, over 4 days, they had a verdict. On July 2nd, 2001, the court was reconvened. The foreman of the jury stood. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. The words, when they came, landed with the force of physical blow. Guilty A single word that brought the most high-profile criminal trial in a generation to its dramatic conclusion. In the public gallery, there were gasps. Jill Dando's family wept, a complex mixture of relief and enduring sorrow. In the dock, Barry George stood motionless, his face a mask of disbelief. The judge, Mr. Justice Gage, donned the black cap and sentenced him to life imprisonment. The headlines the next day were triumphant. Dando killer locked up. Justice for Jill. For the police, for the prosecution, and for much of the public, it was over. The narrative was complete. The strange man from Fulham was the killer. The monster had been caught. The nation could finally breathe a sigh of relief. A sense of closure, that most coveted of feelings, had been achieved. But closure is a dangerous illusion. It's a neat and tidy box we try to put messy, chaotic reality into. The story of Barry George's conviction seemed neat on the surface, but if you pulled at the threads, it began to unravel with alarming speed. The verdict had been delivered, but the questions had not gone away. Inside the prison system, Barry George maintained his innocence from day one. He was a problematic prisoner. His eccentric behavior didn't stop at the prison gates. But he was also a man fighting a system he believed had wrongly condemned him. And he wasn't alone. A small but dedicated group of supporters, including his family and a few journalists who had been troubled by the trial, began to dig. They believed that a grave miscarriage of justice had taken place. They believed that the police and the jury had been blinded by Barry George's weirdness. They had seen a strange man with a strange past, and they had fitted him into the crime, rather than letting the evidence speak for itself. The first major crack in the conviction appeared in 2002. An independent forensic review was commissioned, and it raised serious doubts about the firearm's residue evidence. The review concluded that the scientific techniques used at the time were not robust enough to definitively link the particle in George's pocket to him having fired a gun. The smoking gun was starting to look more like smoke and mirrors. This emboldened George's legal team. They launched their first appeal in 2002, but it was rejected. The Court of Appeal agreed that the evidence was thin, but they ruled that it was not so thin as to render conviction unsafe. The jury, they said, had heard all the arguments and had made their decision. The system, for now, was holding its ground, but the pressure was building. High-profile journalists like Bob Woffenden, who had made a career out of investigating miscarriages of justice, began to shine a light on the case's many flaws. They highlighted the lack of any other evidence. No motive had ever been established for why Barry George would kill Jill Dando. The prosecution's theory of an obsession was just that, a theory. There was no evidence he had ever tried to contact her, no letters, no direct threats beyond the general fixation on fame that he exhibited. They also pointed to the other theories that the police had seemingly sidelined. The Serbian connection, for instance, while difficult to prove, it remained a plausible explanation for a professional-style hit. Had the police's rush to convict a local oddball allowed the real assassins to escape justice? The question lingered, poised in the supposed closure of conviction. The years passed. Barry George languished in prison, his name synonymous with evil. The case faded from the front pages, becoming a part of true crime folklore. The story was settled. The Dando case was closed. But in the quiet, methodical world of criminal appeals, something was stirring. George's legal team, refusing to give up, was preparing a new assault on conviction. They had a new weapon, a fresh forensic report commissioned by the Criminal Cases Review Commission, the independent body that investigates potential miscarriages of justice. This new report was devastating. It went further than ever before. stating that the firearms residue evidence was not just weak, but fundamentally unreliable. It should never have been presented to the jury in the way it was. The report argued, evidence that could have unfairly swayed the jury towards a guilty verdict. Armed with this new, powerful critique, Barry George's legal team launched their second appeal. In 2007, 8 years after the murder and 6 years after his conviction, the case returned to the Court of Appeal. This time, the atmosphere was different. The world had moved on. The initial shock and desire for closure had faded, replaced by a more sober, analytical look at the facts of the case. The Lord Chief Justice, Lord Phillips, delivered the judgment. He spoke of the thinness of the case against Barry George. He spoke of firearms residue evidence as being the only significant forensic link. And then he delivered the words that no one expected. He stated that the evidence was so tainted by the possibility of contamination that his admission into the trial had rendered the conviction unsafe. On August 1st, 2007, Barry George's conviction was quashed. He was a free man. The man the nation had been told was the cold-blooded killer Jill Dando was walking out of the Royal Courts of Justice. Having spent 8 years in prison for a crime the court now believed he may not have committed. It was a staggering moment, a complete reversal. The closure that had been sold to the public in 2001 was revealed to be a fallacy. The story was not over. In fact, the murder of Jill Dando was once again an open case. The police were back to square one, and the central, terrifying question returned, louder and more urgent than ever before. If Barry George didn't kill Jill Dando, who did? An acquittal is not an exoneration. A court can say a conviction is unsafe without definitively declaring a person innocent. But in the court of public opinion, the quashing of Barry George's conviction shattered the official narrative of the Jill Dando case. It left a vacuum. And into that vacuum rushed a wilderness of mirrors, a labyrinth of competing theories, each reflecting a different possible truth. The police were left to re-examine everything, to look down roads they had once dismissed. We are now going to walk that same path. We will explore the main theories, not as fact, but as possibilities. Because in a case with no answers, all possibilities must be considered. Let's start with a theory that the defense found so compelling. The theory that the police, in their haste to find a suspect, may have ignored the most obvious explanation for the crime signature. Its professionalism. Theory 1. The Serbian connection. In the spring of 1999, NATO, led by the United States and the United Kingdom, was conducting a massive air campaign against the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. The stated goal was to halt the humanitarian crisis in Kosovo. The bombing was controversial, and it provoked a fierce propaganda war. The BBC World Service, with its global reach, was a key voice in this conflict. It was seen by Serbian nationalists as a tool of Western propaganda. In the weeks leading up to Jill Dando's murder, Serbian media had been inciting hatred against NATO and its supporters. On April 21st, just 5 days before the murder, the newspaper Politica Express reportedly published an article naming several BBC journalists as targets for retaliation. The murder of Jill Dando was not a frenzied attack. It was a professional hit. A single, close-range shot to the head. No witnesses to the act itself. The killer vanishing without a trace, leaving no forensic evidence. This is the MO of a trained assassin, not a local oddball with a grudge. Proponents of this theory argue that Jill Dando was targeted as a symbolic figurehead of the BBC. Her murder was a message, a way of saying, we can reach you anywhere. Even your most beloved citizens are not safe. The police did investigate this angle. They traveled to the Balkans. They interviewed Serbian intelligence officials, but they could never find a definitive link. No smoking gun, no order from on high, no confession. It remains a compelling, yet circumstantial, theory, but it explains how the murder better than almost any other. Theory 2. The criminal underworld. Jill Dando wasn't just a presenter of Holiday. She was the face of Crime Watch. In that role, she directly appealed to the public for help in catching some of Britain's most dangerous criminals. She put faces to names. She reconstructed crimes. She helped secure convictions that put many people behind bars. Is it possible that she made a powerful enemy? A criminal boss, a drug dealer, or a gangster who decided to silence the voice that was causing them so much trouble? A contract killing would also fit the professional nature of the murder. It would explain the lack of a personal motive and the clinical execution. Again, the police looked into this. They reviewed recent Crime Watch cases. They investigated criminals who might have had the means and the motive, but as with the Serbian theory, they could never find a direct link. No threat was ever made against Jill Dando personally. She was a presenter, reading a script, not an investigating officer. It's possible that her role was seen as more symbolic than operational by the criminal fraternity, but it remains a plausible, if unsubstantiated, line of inquiry. Theory 3. The unknown stalker. The conviction of Barry George was based on the idea of an obsessed stalker. The failure of his case doesn't necessarily invalidate the theory itself. It's entirely possible that the police identified the correct type of killer, but the wrong person. Jill Dando was one of the most famous women in Britain. It is statistically inevitable that she would have attracted unwanted attention from obsessive individuals. The world is full of people who form unhealthy attachments to celebrities. These fixations can simmer for years, curdling into resentment and a desire for control or revenge, especially if the stalker feels spurned or ignored by the object of their affection. This stalker would be different from Barry George. More intelligent, more disciplined, more capable of meticulous planning. Someone who could study Jill's routines, identify a vulnerability, and execute a plan with chilling precision, leaving no trace. This is perhaps the most frightening theory of all. It suggests that the killer was not a professional assassin or a known criminal, but an ordinary-looking man, living a double life, a ghost in the machine who simply vanished back into obscurity after the murder. The police received thousands of calls about potential stalkers after the murder. It's possible the real killer was among them, but his call was missed or he was never identified at all. Theory 4, the random act. This is the most difficult theory to accept because it offers no reason, no logic, no motive we can understand. It suggests that Jill Dando's murder was a case of mistaken identity or a random, senseless act of violence that went horribly wrong. Perhaps it was a robbery that was interrupted, with the killer panicking and firing the gun before fleeing, though nothing was stolen. Perhaps she was mistaken for someone else, a target for a jealous ex-partner or a business rival. Perhaps it was simply the act of a deranged individual who chose his victim at random, a person who walked down that street at that moment, and for no other reason than sheer horrific chance. The problem with this theory is the nature of the killing. A single execution-style shot doesn't feel random. It feels deliberate. But the human mind is capable of terrible and illogical things. We cannot rule out the possibility that the search for a complex, grand motive is a fool's errand, and that the truth is simply unbearably random. For theories, a Serbian hit, a criminal contract, an unknown stalker, or a random act of violence. Each has its proponents and its flaws. Each leaves us with more questions than answers. The police, to their credit, have never closed a case. It remains an active, cold case investigation. But with the passage of time, witnesses' memories fade, evidence is lost, and the chances of finding a definitive answer grow slimmer every year. The wilderness of mirrors shows no sign of offering a clear reflection. More than 2 decades have passed since that bright spring morning in Fulham. The world has moved on in countless ways. The Millennium Dome is now the O2 Arena. The war in Kosovo is a distant memory. A whole generation has grown up who never knew Jill Dando as a living, breathing presence on their screens. And yet, the shadow of her murder remains. It has left a legacy, not just a mystery unsolved, but profound and lasting change. The most immediate legacy was the collapse of the case against Barry George. It stands as one of the most notorious miscarriages of justice in modern British history. It forced a reckoning within the police and the legal system. It highlighted the immense danger of building a case on circumstantial evidence and on the perceived oddness of a suspect. It served as a stark reminder that the desire for closure can never be allowed to eclipse the requirement for proof. For the BBC, the loss was personal and deep. It was an attack on one of their own, an attack on the very idea of the trusted, beloved broadcaster. Security for prominent presenters was increased. The sense of invulnerability, the feeling that they were somehow separate from the dark stories they reported on, was shattered forever. And for the public, the murder of Jill Dando represented the death of innocence. It was a moment when the celebrity culture of the 90s collided with the brutal reality of violent crime. It showed that fame was not a shield, that a front door was not a fortress, and that evil could strike anywhere at any time without reason or warning. The outpouring of grief in 1999 was not just for a TV presenter. It was for a lost sense of safety. But the most enduring legacy is the mystery itself. The question that has never been answered: who killed Jill Dando? It has become a landmark case in the canon of true crime, a subject of endless debate, documentaries, and books. It haunts the retired police officers who worked on it. It haunts the journalists who covered it. And it haunts anyone who remembers that day and the profound shock of it all. In the final analysis, we are left with the facts. A woman was murdered. A man's life was wrongly destroyed. The real killer has never been found. The theories remain just that, theories. The Serbian connection is plausible but unproven. The criminal underworld theory is logical but lacks evidence. The stalker theory is psychologically compelling, but has no identified suspect. The random act theory is almost too horrific to contemplate. So, what can we conclude after all this time? We can conclude that the murder of Jill Dando was likely the work of a professional or someone with a professional mindset. The lack of evidence, the clean nature of the kill, the speed of the escape, all point to a level of planning and skill far beyond that of a typical opportunist or disorganized individual. We can conclude that the initial investigation, while immense in scale, was flawed in its focus. The tunnel vision on Barry George, while understandable given the pressure, may have allowed the true perpetrator to escape justice, never to be seriously investigated again. And we must conclude with the humbling admission that we may never know the truth. Some mysteries are never solved. Some questions are never answered. Some ghosts never rest. The file on Operation Oxblood remains open, a silent testament to a failure of justice. But it is also a symbol of hope, a refusal to forget. Jill Dando's life was one of light and warmth. She represented the best of us. Her death was an act of darkness. The greatest injustice is not just that she was taken, but that the reason why remains lost in the shadows. The story of her murder is not just a whodunit. It's a story about fame, obsession, justice, and the terrifying, enduring power of the unknown. It is a wound on the soul of a nation that has never truly healed. The murder of Jill Dando remains one of the most haunting unsolved cases of our time. A crime that stripped away a nation's innocence and left behind a void that has never been filled. The search for the truth continues, not just in the cold case files of Scotland Yard, but in the minds of everyone who remembers that day and who still asks the question, more than 20 years on, who killed Jill Dando? We have spent almost hours together, walking through the intricate and painful details of this case. Thank you for staying with us, for giving this story the time and attention it deserves. If you found this deep dive valuable, please remember to like this video. It helps our channel immensely. And if you haven't already, subscribe for more long-form, investigative documentaries that refuse to let the forgotten stories be forgotten. Leave a comment below with your thoughts on the case. What do you think happened? The conversation is just as important as the investigation. Thank you for watching.